welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are some cards I've been taking out of my decks recently for a variety of reasons. I guess a lot of it has to do with power creep. A lot of it also has to do with, other things happening in the format, making these other things not so good, which of course I will get to. And also, in some cases, it's a card just looks really good on its face, and then you try it out for a while. And in some cases, I tried these out probably way longer than I should have, and I realized, yeah, it's actually not performing how I had hoped. So I ended up taking it out. I already alluded to in my Foundations review that Flawless Maneuver is a card that I have stopped putting in my decks or taken out of my decks. I believe I have this in 0 decks now. It just doesn't perform that well anymore, I guess. 2 and a white instant. If you control your commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. Of course, that's great, and creatures you control get indestructible until end of turn. Of course, this came out in the Ikoria free spell cycle, and as soon as I saw this one, I fell in love with it. I had a similar thought about Fierce Guardianship. Like, for me, it was, what a fantastic way to protect your commander, because if your commander's on the table, and especially if you have like a 6-mana commander that you have to tap out to play, and then someone removes it right away before you have the chance to do anything, that sucks, right? So a Fierce Guardianship was great for protecting your commander there, and so was Flawless Maneuver. That's why I liked it so much, and I grabbed a couple copies to put in a couple of my white decks, and for a couple of reasons, it has become less good. I mean, obviously, we've just gotten so many board wipes that get around indestructible, as I said in the video talking about Blasphemous Edict, because there's a card that gets around Flawless Maneuver, of course. For that reason, cards like this, the cards that just make your team indestructible and that's it, they've gotten a lot less usable. There's a lot of board wipes that'll get around that now. So that's part of the reason. Another reason is because I've just become more of a method 2 deck builder where I don't always have my commander on the table, right? A lot of people just shoehorn these into their decks without thinking, okay, am I actually going to have my commander on the table all the time? Maybe your commander just costs a lot, and so you're not really going to have it out for most of the game. Maybe you're just not really building around your commander that much, the method 2 way. So this is never going to be free. And of course, 3 mana to make your team indestructible is way better options for that as well, right? So this is a card that certainly for me has fallen to the wayside, and I don't know if I would ever put it in a deck again. Poison the Cup, and I could probably throw a few black removal spells in here. This is one that when it came out in Kaldheim I was a huge fan of. 1 black, instant, destroy target creature. If this spell was foretold, scry 2, and it is foretell 1 and a black. And I'm a big fan of the foretell mechanic in the commander format for a variety of reasons. Your opponent doesn't know what it is. I mean, you're alluding to what it might be. People always like to guess whenever you foretell a card, depending on what colors your deck is. People will be like, I bet this is a Raven form, or I bet that's Sod Coming, or, whatever the case may be. Maybe if you're playing black, they might figure out it's Poison the Cup, but in that moment, 2 mana to kill a creature is pretty good, and then the Scry 2 as well. I also like that Foretell can save you from having to discard cards and stuff like that also, but this is just certainly a power crept situation where there's just so many better mono black removal spells now. I probably have like 8 copies of this sitting in my box, unfortunately. I've taken it out of all of my decks. There's just too many better versions. Fleshbag Marauder, very similar. And again, this is one that was just a commander staple forever that people would put in their decks, mostly because it got rid of Voltron commanders, right? The sacrifice effects were great against Voltron strategies. So 2 and a black with Zombie Warrior 3/1. And when it enters the battlefield, of course, each player sacrifices a creature, and you can just sacrifice your Fleshbag Marauder, get a dice trigger, it fits in a whole bunch of themes for all of the reasons that you want to be using this card. It forces your opponents to sacrifice. You want to be sacrificing. Maybe you can get it back out of the graveyard. This is just the worst version of this now. That's it, right? And I used to play more effects like this. This is also one where, okay, I'm not going to be facing those Ural the Miststalker decks so much anymore, so I don't worry about that scenario as much. So I have taken it out of my decks for that reason. But also there's just way better versions, right? This is like the bottom of the barrel version now for this kind of thing. I really have to be going really deep before I'm going to be putting a Fleshbag Marauder in my deck with regards to the effects that it does, right? So I imagine not a lot of people are playing this card anymore. Perplexing Test is a card that I think I only put this in 1 deck, and I had it in there for quite some time until I eventually took it out. And this is one that is a little sort of deceptive in how it can be. It looks good on its face. Desynchronization is another one that I talked about recently, that it looks really good and you want to try it out and it doesn't end up working as good as you had hoped every time. A lot of people might think that this is fantastic for what you want to be doing, and if it works good for you, that's fine. For me, I found it didn't work as good as just the alternate versions that I could be using. So 3 blue, blue, instant, choose one, return all creature tokens to the owner's hand, or return all non-token creatures to owner's hands. And I just found that in 99% of situations, I'd rather just have an evacuation, right? That's the card I'm talking about, that is just going to do the exact same thing, except it's going to hit all creatures, right? There is very few situations for me, and of course I put this in a deck where I'm making lots of tokens. It was my Tishana deck where I do token copy creation, and I thought, okay, well, that's perfect because I won't bounce my token creatures to hand, and I will bounce my non-token creatures to hand, which in a lot of cases I want because there's a lot of great ETB creatures there. Sure, but the utility for cards like this is sort of secondary, whereas the main purpose you want to be playing this card is for creature removal, right? It's getting my opponent's creature off the table. If you're only playing this to bounce my own creatures to hand, I just don't think that's a great way to use this card or a great purpose for putting it in your deck. For me, I want to use this for my opponents all have token creatures, and I'm going to bounce all those, and of course they don't come back. But then I'm not hitting their non-token creatures, so they get to keep those. It's rare that you're going to come across a deck that's going to have a whole lot of token creatures in play and not any non-token creatures. So it hurts them a whole lot and not you. But then even if it does do that, it's not really going to hurt your other opponents. Like, how often are you going to be in the situation where all of your opponents are playing token decks where this can just be sort of a one-sided board wipe? If that's the case, if you have a pod where that's happening a lot, this could be a great card for you. But I just found for me that 99% of the time, I'd rather have an evacuation in my hand and just hit all creatures. The Memorial Cycle, and this is a whole cycle of cards that I stopped playing. I'm pretty sure I played all of these in decks at one point. So there was a cycle of all of them. They were all lands that entered the battlefield tapped at a particular color of mana and then had some ability. And all the abilities were very usable in a commander game. And I thought, well, why not put them in there? The only downside is entering the battlefield tapped. It gives you the colored mana. It's great. And later in the game, I can use some ability like Memorial to Unity, 2 and a green, tap, sacrifice it. Look at the top 5 cards of your library and put a creature card from among them into your hand and put the rest on the bottom. That's pretty good, right? I just never used it. And in fact, this one in particular, I think I had in 1 or 2 decks, and I've never used that ability in a commander game. I just found that I always wanted to be doing other stuff with my mana. The ability's okay, but it's not good enough to sacrifice a land and then also tap 3 mana. I always had better things I could be doing. And also, I am really trying to get away from lands that enter the battlefield tapped. I really don't like that at all. I'm only going to put a land in my deck that enters the battlefield tapped if it is mana fixing me. Of course, that you have to do, right? If I'm going to put like in a 3-color deck, I got to put that Triome in there. Of course, it's going to enter the battlefield tapped. That's okay. It's giving me all the colors I need. That is worth it for me. If I'm going to put in a utility land that enters the battlefield tapped, it better be really, really good, because it's probably also just adding colorless mana. So that's a rare one for me. As far as a land like this, it's only giving me 1 color of mana. For me, again, I had all the different colors in all my different decks, and I eventually just started taking them all out to replace them with better utility lands. So I'm pretty sure I don't play any of this cycle anymore. Speaking of lands entering the battlefield tapped, and this is where I'm probably going to get a lot of pushback, MDFC lands in general can fall into this topic, but I'm talking about Sejiri Shelter here particularly. This for me was just an auto include in every white deck, and Kabiri Takedown would be another one, and that's another one that is that one I'm more likely to put in than this one, because this one, just like with Flawless Maneuver, I just find less likely to actually be usable for me. 1 in a white instant, target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn, which is good. That's great. Of course, if I want an effect like this in white, there's way better options. Lots of them. This is also a land on the back, right? So that's why I'm putting it in my deck. Sejiri Glacier taps to add a white and enters the battlefield tap. But, and this is my mentality about it, guys. I know you're all going to disagree, but this is my mentality when it comes to MDFCs. And I was just like everybody, where when these first came out in Zendikar Rising, I just shoehorned them into all my decks. And I still do play Balagad Recovery, Malakir Rebirth. Those are the 2 that I think are probably the best, the most auto-includes for me. But those ones are ones where the effect you're getting on the front is good. It's not a worse version. Malakir Rebirth is not a worse version. It's essentially the standard for an effect like that. Whereas with a card like Sejiri Shelter, this effect is not that good. For 2 mana, I would much rather just play a Blacksmith skill and give my creature hexproof and indestructible in a turn, because that's going to protect against pretty much everything, whereas this is only going to protect against a few specific things and cost more mana. But wait, it's a land on the back, right? Yeah, but it's a bad land on the back. And now I'm putting a worse version of a land in my deck. So I don't know. I know people will disagree with me, but with all MDFCs, and I talked about this in a video for which I got so much pushback because I just don't think people understood what I was getting at. When it comes to MDFCs, why are you putting it in your deck? Are you putting it in your deck as a land, or are you putting it in your deck as whatever the thing is on the front? It's got to take up one of those slots in your deck. You're taking a land out and putting this in? Because if you're taking out a land and putting this in, you just put a worse land in your deck, a land that enters the battlefield tapped and only gives you white mana for an effect on the back that, you know, maybe you'll use, maybe not. You know, there has been maybe 1 or 2 situations where I've actually cast a Sejiri Shelter and saved my creature. Most of the times, it's just been played as a bad land. So I think ultimately in that situation, I'm just putting a worse land in my deck, right? If you're putting this in your deck for the front side because I got to put protection in my deck, of course you do, right? You have to put stuff in your deck that's going to protect your creatures. Okay, but there's 1,000 better options in this. This is a bad option of that. Oh, it's also a land on the back? So what? I don't care about a land on the back. I care about the front. I'm putting a worse version of a protection spell in my deck just so the off chance that maybe I can play a land, right? So why are you putting it in your deck, right? I could apply this logic to a whole lot of things, and I don't want to get on a side tangent here, but Feld of Profane is another card that everyone seems to love. I think it might even be, for sure, one of the most popular cards from Modern Horizons 3 that everyone's shoehorning into all their decks. For me, that's a really bad removal spell on the front, and it's not a very good land on the back. Why are you putting it in your deck? Are you putting it in your deck for a removal spell? You just put a bad removal spell on your deck because the off chance you might play it as a land. To me, that logic doesn't add up in my head. The things you need to be doing in your deck, like removal and protecting your creatures, is crucial. It's so important. So why would you put worse versions in your deck on the off chance that maybe you're going to play it as a land? If you're putting it in as your land slot, now you're putting a worse land in your deck. And of course, lands are the most important thing you can put in any commander deck, or any magic deck at all for that matter, because of course you need them to be tapping them for mana to be casting your spells. So you're putting a worse version of that in your deck because maybe you'll cast the backside. Again, a lot of people would say that it's worth it for them. For me, it's not worth it. I am more and more taking MDFCs out of my deck. This is one that I don't think I'm playing at all anymore. Hullbreaker Horror is a card that I actually took out of my deck a while ago. I added it onto this list because it fits into a different category that I have touched on from time to time on my channel, and I want to touch on again in this video. So 5 blue, Kraken Horror, 7/8. Flash, this spell can't be countered, because of course they have to put all that on there. And then also whenever you cast a spell, choose up to 1, return target spell you don't control to owner's hand, turn target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So of course a incredibly powerful card that really is just the game ending scenario for a lot of decks. And that's exactly what I did when this card came out. As soon as I saw it, I'm like, wow, that's a card that I can just put into any mono blue deck. And at the time I threw it in my Abishon deck, which did have a little bit of trouble closing out games. So I'm just sitting there doing my thing on my Abishon deck, you know, what my Abishon deck does, basically until I draw my Hullbreaker Horror, which I then cast and then use that to close the game out. Well, of course, what am I doing there? I'm stealing the win away from myself, right? I'm not really, like, my win con is this guy. This guy is just winning me the game now, and whatever else I was doing in my deck didn't really matter a whole lot. So it also fits into the category of a card that people just hate, and it just annoys people, and as soon as they see it, it's a kill on sight card, all of that kind of stuff. It's just a kind of a feel bad card all around, I found, where people didn't really like what it was doing in a commander game, and also I didn't really like playing it because it felt like this was doing all the work and it didn't really matter what else I was doing in my deck. So I think I had this in 2 decks. I ended up taking out of both. I don't play it anymore. A very old card that I don't play anymore, sadly, is Yavi Elder, and this is a kind of a bit of a nostalgia card for me, and it is a really good commander card. It actually just got reprinted in Duskmourn, funny enough. So 1 green, a human druid, 2/1. When it dies, you may search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reel them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle. Pay 2, sacrifice Yavi Elder, draw a card. And, you know, again, I don't want to tell people that you should stop playing these cards. It's not what this video is about. I'm giving you specific reasons why I stopped playing certain cards on this list. This one is not a card that I stopped playing because it's bad. I think it's great card advantage. It is a total of 5 mana to get 2 lands and then a random card draw into your hand, which is not great. It's okay. It's not definitely not bad. If you want creatures in your graveyard, it's extra good. If you want to be sacrificing creatures, you want dice triggers, you can get creatures back out of your graveyard, recursion strategy, whatever the case may be. There's lots of strategies where this would fit really, really well. For me, I don't really have a strategy where it fits really, really well. It was just a sort of good stuff commander card that I just put in a lot of my decks that eventually I started to cut, right? All those commander staples, those good stuff cards that I used to play in the format have sort of gone to the wayside a little bit. That's what happens when you just keep getting more and more and more thousands of commander cards every year, right? The ones that you just put in your deck just because they're good, those start getting cut. And it's not just a power creep thing. It's also I want to be doing the thing that my deck is doing, right? I mean, first of all, this is not actually ramp, which if I'm in green, I likely want to use a creature that's actual ramp, a creature that's going to put lands directly into play rather than just in my hand. There are definitely decks that would prefer to have lands in your hand. Maybe you can just make multiple land drops in a turn, so this might be better there. For me, though, I don't have a deck where this specifically fits, so it's going to end up getting replaced by better stuff, right? Negate. That's right. Negate is going to the wayside for me. 1 and a blue instant, counter target non-creature spell if you haven't seen it before. And I guess, is this a power creep thing? I guess we just get more options. It's not so much power creep as it is we're just getting other options. And usually I just end up picking the options that either synergize with my deck or for whatever reason are fitting with what my deck is doing. Obviously, in the Dovin's Veto scenario, there's a just better version if I'm playing a white-blue deck. So if I'm playing a white-blue deck, which I have two, I'm going to put Dovin's Veto in there over a Negate. I don't want to get too much into the whole ranking system when it comes to counterspells, but, an offer you can't refuse is going in there first. I really saw it coming because, again, I like Foretell, and also it's likely only going to cost 1 and a blue, which is what Negate costs, but of course Negate only hits non-creature spells, so I would say 90% of the time saw it coming is going to be better. I don't put a lot of counter spells in my deck, I'll just say that. For me, I only put 2 or 3. Even on a mono blue deck, I would maybe put 4, and I might still have this in one of my mono blue decks. I have 2 mono blue decks, and this might be in one of them. Basically, this is a combination of a power creep situation, and also we just get more options. Not necessarily better. It doesn't mean that the counter spells we're getting in all these sets are better than Negate necessarily. They're just doing other things. They have little tack-on abilities that for whatever reason will fit in that particular deck that I'm playing. So I'm going to replace Negate with that, right? I'll end up with Plas of Heroes, which is a card that when I first saw it, I immediately had to make a video about it when it got spoiled because I was like, well, that's going to go in every deck. And really, it's actually not. And maybe the people that pushed back on me in that video were maybe more right than I was. I mean, maybe this is a case where I was wrong on this card. It's a land, and it's a colorless land. So like I say all the time, and I just did in my Foundations video, whenever you have a colorless land, that's the easiest thing to slot in any commander deck because, of course, it's colorless, so it means it can go in any commander deck, and also it's a land, so it's super easy to slot in. And pretty much all of my decks, it is a mix and match swapping scenario with all my utility lands. Again, it depends on how many you want to put in there. How many colorless lands do you want in your deck? How many lands that enter the battlefield tapped? How many utility lands? All of that. I like playing less colors. That's one of the reasons why it's easier to throw these colorless utility lands into my decks. My monocolored decks have 5 or 6 or whatever. And, I'll swap them out, put some in, take some out. This is one that I've been taking out. I might have this still in one deck. I used to have it in a bunch of decks. Again, I was a huge fan when it first came out. Taps to add a colorless, also taps to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana, only cast a legendary spell, which of course you can use to cast your commander. You don't have to be doing legendary tribal, although this is probably a lot better in legendary tribal. Tap, add 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control. Same as the last ability, right? Better in legendary tribal, but if your commander's on the battlefield, likely this will tap for any color of mana. But the main reason why I thought it was going to go in a whole lot of decks is pay 3 and tap, exile Plas of Heroes, target legendary creature, gains hexproof and indestructible in a turn. Okay, it's a land that can protect your commander. That alone means I can easily slot it into any deck. And I did put this, I think I put this in all my monocolored decks, which of course I have a bunch. And I started to realize I'm not using it ever. Because 2 reasons. 1, it is kind of a lot of mana. And how often are you going to be leaving this open and 3 other mana? That's not going to happen a lot, right? But also, just like with a lot of the other cards I mentioned, there was better options. I already had a lot of ways to protect my commander, even in my mono red Browlin deck, that was the one for sure. I was like, okay, mono red's not great at protecting its stuff, so I got to put Plas of Heroes in there because it's one of the only ways that I can protect my commander. And it's kind of a monolith commander deck, and I need my commander in play. I never used it, not once. And in fact, however many years it's been for sure at least 2 years since this card came out, and I had it in at least 6 or 7 decks. Not once have I used that last ability. Not one time did I pay 3 to activate that last ability and make a legendary creature hexproof and indestructible. It never happened. And again, that's the process for which I'm looking through my decks and I'm thinking, Plas of Heroes, right? Because I want to put in this new utility land that just came out in the last set. And I'm like, I never actually use that ability, right? That's the process that I use. The thinking is, okay, this seems really good, but yet I've never, ever used that ability in any of my decks. So I guess it's going out. And even in my mono red Browlin deck, I started to realize, man, maybe I overdid it here a little bit. I got Medicine Bag to regenerate my commander. I have Commander's Plate, of course, great way to protect your commander in colorless form. I actually had a bunch of ways, and I didn't need Plas of Heroes. I was actually doing just fine. So it is a combination of this card maybe looks better than it really is on its face. It can get tricky sometimes with these activated abilities. Like I'll just say Tyrite Sanctum is one for me that I probably would play over a Plas of Heroes because I don't have to leave mana up, right? There's a card, and I guess it doesn't give the hexproof, but with that card, I would prefer it, and I definitely have used that card a whole bunch. I have that in a bunch of decks, and I use it all the time. I've activated both of those abilities, I don't know, more times than I can count, because I don't have to wait in the moment, right? I can just make my commander into a god and then make it indestructible at my own pace. I don't have to wait. That's the bad thing about this land is I have to leave the mana open on the off chance that my opponent casts a board wipe or removal spell or whatever. It's not bad, okay? I still think it's perfectly fine. And I think I have this in one deck still maybe, although I might take it out if some better utility land comes along. Again, it depends on the deck, right? Obviously each deck, you're going to want certain utility. Maybe I want an Inventor's Fair in there because it's an artifact deck, right? Or maybe I need a Blast Zone in there because again, it's a mono red deck. I have trouble getting rid of enchantments. Or maybe like in my Browlin deck particularly, I put Ghost Town in there because that was a way better fit in that deck, a card that I'm going to use way more often than I will a Plas of Heroes, right? So it depends on your deck and how many utility lands you want to shoehorn into there. And if you want to keep putting them in there, Plas of Heroes might be the card that's coming out. And that certainly was the case for me. There you go. A bunch of cards I took out of my decks and the particular reasons why. Maybe gets the wheels turning for you guys that, maybe you should reevaluate some of these cards. It is a little bit of a power creep thing. We do get better options. It is also and again, it's not just this card strictly better. In some cases it is. But it's also, okay, well, there's just a new card that came out that is a counterspell or a creature removal spell or protection or whatever that just happens to fit better in my particular deck. So now instead of playing this generic version of a counterspell or a removal spell, I can play one that actually fits with what I'm doing, right? It is partly that as well, right? And getting all these new cards all the time, that is certainly going to be happening. You guys let me know in the comments below if you're playing any of these cards or taking out any of these cards, or maybe you just never played these cards to begin with because you didn't think they were very good. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.